The heavy, dirt-stained burlap sack hit my pristine white quartz countertop with a dull, sickening thud, puffing a cloud of dry earth into the air I usually filled with the scent of expensive French roast and fresh lilies. My husband Mark didn't look at me. He just stared at the sack as if it contained the secret to our future, rather than a crude demand for my humiliation. "Pack your oldest things, Elena," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth that had sustained me for 7 years. "You're going to my mother's farm for the next month to dig potatoes. She's getting old, the harvest is early, and she can't afford hired help this year." The sheer absurdity of it should have made me laugh, but the coldness in his eyes stopped the breath in my throat, especially when he slid a one-way bus ticket across the counter and informed me that he had already sent my SUV to a specialized mechanic 3 towns over for preventative maintenance. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Just yesterday, I was Elena Vance, a lead architect at one of the city's most prestigious firms, a woman who spent her days designing glass and steel marvels, and her evenings in the warm, secure embrace of a man I considered my soulmate. Now I was being told to abandon my career and my home to perform manual labor in a remote village where the mud was thick and the resentment of my mother-in-law, Tamara, was even thicker. I felt a sudden, sharp prick of nausea, the kind that comes when you realize the floor you're standing on is actually a trapdoor. I looked down at my hands, manicured, soft, accustomed to the weight of a stylus and the texture of blueprint paper, and then back at the burlap sack. Mark finally looked up, but his gaze was flat, distant, as if he were looking through me at a wall he intended to demolish. Before this moment, my life felt like a masterpiece of my own design. I had spent my entire 20s clawing my way up in a male-dominated industry, and my greatest achievement wasn't a building, but the restoration of the Silverwood estate. It was a sprawling, Victorian-style manor I had inherited from my grandfather, a crumbling ruin that I had poured every cent of my savings and every ounce of my soul into. For 5 years, I had lived in dust and scaffolding, personally choosing every slab of marble and every brass fixture. When Mark and I married, I didn't see him as a financial partner. I didn't need one. I saw him as the person who would fill those rooms with laughter and eventually the pitter-patter of children's feet. Our life together was a series of beautiful, choreographed rituals. Every morning, the sunlight would stream through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our bedroom, and Mark would bring me a cup of Earl Grey, kissing my forehead before I even opened my eyes. We had a rhythm, a quiet, expensive, comfortable rhythm. He was a consultant for a logistics firm, or so he told me, often traveling for site visits. I never questioned him. Why would I? He was the man who held me when I cried after my father passed away, the man who toasted my every promotion with vintage champagne. Our home was our sanctuary, a fortress of taste and tranquility that sat on 3 acres of prime real estate, protected by a state-of-the-art security system and a heavy wrought iron gate. Then there was Tamara. My mother-in-law was a woman who wore her salt-of-the-earth heritage like a suit of armor, using it to deflect any criticism and to sharpen her barbs against me. To her, I was the city princess who didn't know the value of a hard day's work. Whenever she visited Silverwood, she would run a calloused finger over my antique furniture and sigh about wastefulness. She lived 4 hours away on a struggling potato farm that had been in her family for generations, a place she described as a holy site of labor and tradition, but which I saw as a black hole for Mark's occasional loans. I had always tried to be the bigger person. I sent her high-end hampers for Christmas, paid for her new roof 2 years ago, and even tolerated her snide comments about my fragile constitution. I thought I was buying peace. I thought that by being generous, I was securing Mark's loyalty and her begrudging respect. I didn't realize I was merely whetting an appetite that could never be satisfied. Mark's behavior had begun to shift about 3 months ago. Though the changes were so subtle, I had written them off as work stress. He became obsessed with the rising costs of our lifestyle, despite the fact that I paid 80% of our expenses. He started taking long walks in the garden, hushed phone calls trailing behind him like smoke. When I would ask him what was wrong, He'd just rub his temples and say, "Family stuff, Elle. My mom's struggling with the land. It's a lot of pressure." I felt a pang of guilt every time he said it. I offered to send more money, but he'd snap, "It's not always about money, Elena. It's about blood. It's about showing you care about where I came from." He made me feel shallow, as if my success were a barrier between us rather than a foundation. He began to weaponize my own comfort against me, making me feel as though my love for our beautiful home was a sign of moral decay. The morning of the burlap sack, the air in the kitchen felt unnaturally still. I had woken up late, a rare luxury, and found Mark already dressed in heavy work boots and flannel, clothes he hadn't worn in years. The smell of the earth from the sack was overwhelming, clashing violently with the expensive jasmine diffuser on the windowsill. "The bus leaves at noon," Mark said, his voice clipping every word. I've already told your office you're taking a leave of absence for a family emergency. I used your email, Elena. I knew you'd argue, and we don't have time for your ego." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, a physical manifestation of the dread pooling in my stomach. "You did what?" "Mark, I have a client meeting for the Riverside project tomorrow. You can't just... You can't decide my life for me. If Tamara needs help, we can hire a crew. I'll pay for it." He stepped closer, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that looked like hatred in his eyes. "You think everything can be solved with your checkbook. My mother needs family. She needs to see that my wife isn't too good to get her hands dirty in the soil that raised me. You're going, Elena. For once in your life, you're going to be useful in a way that doesn't involve a computer screen." The room began to spin. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. It wasn't just the demand. It was the calculated way he had dismantled my defenses. My car, my job, my communication. It felt like a kidnapping disguised as a chore. But beneath the shock, a tiny, quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was fundamentally wrong. This wasn't about potatoes. This was a displacement. He wanted me gone. He wanted me away from Silverwood, away from my accounts, and away from him. "I'm not going," I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark didn't yell. He didn't lose his temper. He simply leaned in, his breath smelling of stale coffee, and said, "The car is gone. The office thinks you're grieving a family crisis. And if you don't get on that bus, I'll tell everyone that the refined Elena Vance has been hiding her pill addiction, the one I've been covering for months. Who do you think they'll believe? The devoted husband or the stressed-out architect?" The ground didn't just move. It vanished. I stared at him, my mouth dry, my vision blurring at the edges. The man I loved was standing in my dream kitchen, threatening to destroy my reputation to force me into a labor camp 4 hours away. My legs felt like lead, and I had to grip the edge of the quartz counter to keep from collapsing. In that moment of pure, blinding terror, I realized I didn't know the man I had shared my bed with for nearly a decade. I was a prisoner in a house I owned, and the warden was the person I had trusted most in the world. I looked at the burlap sack again, and this time, it didn't just look like dirt. It looked like a grave. The bus ride to the village of Oakhaven felt like a funeral procession, where I was both the mourner and the corpse. I sat in the back, my designer coat a jarring splash of camel hair against the cracked vinyl seats, watching the city skyline, my world of glass and ambition, recede into a gray blur. Every mile that passed felt like a stitch being ripped out of the life I had spent a decade sewing together. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a message from Mark saying it was all a sick joke, a momentary lapse in sanity. But my screen remained dark, save for the reflection of my own hollowed-out eyes. He had already changed the passwords to our shared cloud storage. I discovered this at a rest stop when I tried to log in to check my project files. The access denied message felt like a physical slap. When I arrived at the farm, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rot. Tamara was waiting for me on the porch of her sagging farmhouse, her arms crossed over her chest, a triumphant smirk playing on her thin, pale lips. She didn't offer a hug, or even a glass of water. She threw a pair of oversized, mud-caked rubber boots at my feet. "The backfield is ready for you, Elena," she said, her voice raspy and sharp. "Don't bother bringing your luggage inside. You'll be sleeping in the guest room in the attic. It's small, but it'll keep you from getting too comfortable. We have work to do." The first 3 days were a blur of agony. My hands, once so precise with a drafting pen, were soon mapped with blisters and raw red scrapes. The soil was heavy and stubborn, clinging to the potatoes like it didn't want to let them go. Tamara watched me from the shade of an old oak tree, sipping iced tea and pointing out every tuber I missed. But it wasn't the labor that began to erode my spirit. It was the atmosphere of secrecy that permeated the house. The warning signs started as whispers. I would come in from the fields, my back screaming in protest, and find Tamara huddled over the kitchen table with a man I didn't recognize, a man in a sharp suit that looked entirely out of place in a farmhouse. They would fall silent the moment I entered, the man snapping his briefcase shut, while Tamara would suddenly become very interested in the stove. "Just a neighbor, Elena. Go wash up, you smell like a stable," she'd snap. But neighbors in Oakhaven didn't wear Italian leather shoes. Then there were the phone calls. I'd hear Tamara in the hallway late at night, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Yes, Mark. She's here. She's too tired to even think. Have you cleared out the study yet? Good. Make sure the appraiser doesn't see the water damage in the basement. We need the top-tier valuation." My heart stopped when I heard the word appraiser. Why would they need an appraiser for Silverwood? I tried to call Mark immediately, but he wouldn't pick up. I left dozens of messages, my voice shifting from confusion to pleading to anger. When he finally called back on the fourth night, his voice was like ice. "Elena, stop being dramatic," he said, and I could hear the sound of a television in the background. My television, in my living room. "I'm just doing some financial restructuring. Mom's farm is collateral for a new venture. I need to make sure our assets are properly documented. Just stay there, do what she says, and stop being so paranoid. You're there to learn humility, remember?" Before I could ask about the appraiser or the new venture, the line went dead. He hadn't asked how I was. He hadn't said he missed me. He had spoken to me like a bothersome employee. The point of no return arrived on a Tuesday, a day of oppressive heat and a sky the color of a bruised plum. Tamara had gone into town to run errands, leaving me with a list of chores that would have taken 3 people to complete. I was supposed to be painting the fence, but the heat was making my head swim. I went into the house to find some aspirin, my footsteps echoing on the warped wooden floorboards. I went to the kitchen, but the drawer where she kept the medicine was locked. Frustrated and feeling a surge of uncharacteristic rebellion, I went to the small office Tamara kept off the parlor. It was a room I was strictly forbidden from entering. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The room smelled of old paper and stale tobacco. On the desk sat a thick blue expansion folder. My breath caught in my throat. On the tab, in Mark's unmistakable, elegant handwriting, were the words, "Silverwood Liquidation." My hands began to shake so violently, I almost couldn't grip the edge of the folder. I pulled it open, and the world seemed to slow down, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall becoming a deafening, rhythmic thud in my ears. The first document was a power of attorney form. My signature was at the bottom, bold, clear, and utterly fraudulent. I hadn't signed this. I would never have signed this. It gave Mark full authority to sell, lease, or encumber any property in my name. Beneath that was a purchase and sale agreement. The buyer was a luxury developer specializing in high-end condominiums. They weren't just buying the house. The contract specified the complete demolition of existing structures to facilitate the construction of the Vistas complex. My grandfather's house, my life's work, my sanctuary. They were going to bulldoze it into the ground. A wave of cold nausea washed over me, so intense I had to sink to my knees on the dusty carpet. My pulse hammered in my ears like a trapped drum, and I felt as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I flipped through more pages, bank statements for accounts I didn't know existed, wire transfer receipts showing hundreds of thousands of dollars being moved from my personal savings into an offshore account in Mark's name. He hadn't just been restructuring, he was gutting me. He had sent me here to this godforsaken farm not to dig potatoes, but to keep me isolated and without transportation while he erased my existence and turned my heritage into a payday. I heard the gravel crunch in the driveway. Tamara was back. Panic, sharp and jagged, pierced through my shock. I scrambled to put the documents back exactly as I had found them, my fingers fumbling with the blue folder. I slipped out of the office and into the hallway just as the front door swung open. Tamara stood there, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light, clutching a grocery bag. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing as she took in my pale face and trembling hands. "What are you doing inside, Elena?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The fence isn't going to paint itself." I forced my voice to stay level, though it felt like I was swallowing glass. I I felt faint. The heat. I just needed some water. She stepped closer, the smell of her cheap perfume clashing with the scent of the old house. She reached out and gripped my chin, her fingers digging into my skin like talons. "You look like you've seen a ghost, princess. Or maybe you've been looking for things that don't belong to you." I stared into her eyes that held no pity, only a cruel, calculating greed. "I'm fine, Tamara," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "I'll go back to the fence." I walked past her, my heart thundering against my ribs. As I stepped out onto the porch, I heard her pick up the phone. I didn't go to the fence. I crept under the open window of the parlor, pressing my back against the rough siding of the house, my breath coming in shallow hitches. "Mark?" Tamara's voice was loud now, filled with a jagged edge of excitement. "She's starting to sniff around. You need to move faster. Is the closing date set?" "Good. Once the money hits, we can drop the addiction story to the lawyers and get the restraining order. She won't have a penny left to fight us. Just make sure you get the rest of her jewelry out of the wall safe tonight. I want that emerald necklace she thinks I don't know about." I slid down the wall, the rough wood scraping my back, and collapsed into the dirt. The betrayal was total. It was architectural. They hadn't just stolen my money. They were stealing my past, my reputation, and my future. I looked at my hands, dirty, bleeding, and trembling, and for the first time in my life, I felt a spark of something hotter and more dangerous than fear. The city princess was gone. In her place was a woman who had designed skyscrapers to withstand hurricanes, and I realized that if Mark and Tamara wanted a war, I was going to give them one they wouldn't survive. The silence in the kitchen was thick enough to choke on, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that sounded like a countdown to my own execution. I stood in the doorway, my boots caked in the very mud they had used to bury my life, and watched Tamara slowly lower the phone. She didn't look startled. She didn't look guilty. She looked like a predator that had finally grown tired of playing with its prey. I felt a strange icy calm settle over me, the kind of stillness that precedes a massive tectonic shift. My heart, which had been racing only moments ago, now beat with a heavy, deliberate thud. "Is the closing date set, Tamara?" I asked, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, low, steady, and sharp as a scalpel. "And did Mark find my emerald necklace, or do I need to tell him exactly which floorboard it's hidden under?" Tamara's eyes narrowed, but her smirk didn't falter. She pulled out a kitchen chair, the wood scraping harshly against the linoleum, and sat down with the grace of a queen on a throne of dirt. "So, the princess has finally learned to listen at doors," she spat, her voice dripping with a venom she no longer bothered to hide. "I suppose it's for the best. I was getting tired of the humble farm girl act. You were never very good at it anyway, Elena. You always smelled of expensive perfume and arrogance, even when you were elbow-deep in my soil." "Forgery is a felony, Tamara," I said, stepping into the room. I felt a tremor in my hands, not from fear, but from a burgeoning, white-hot rage. "That power of attorney, the sale of Silverwood. You and Mark are going to prison. Do you honestly think a luxury developer won't do their due diligence? Do you think I won't fight this?" Tamar laughed, a dry hacking sound that grated on my nerves. "Fight with what? You have no car. Your phone is about to be disconnected from our family plan, and every penny you think you have is currently being moved into accounts you can't touch. And as for the developer, they don't care who signs the papers as long as the title is clear, and Mark is making sure of that. Just then, the back door creaked open. Mark walked in, carrying a small leather valise. My valise. He froze when he saw me standing there, filthy and defiant. For a second, a flicker of the man I used to love appeared in his eyes, a shadow of guilt, a ghost of a conscience. But it was gone as quickly as a breath on a mirror. He looked away, focusing intently on a spot on the floor. Mark, I whispered, the name feeling like ash in my mouth. Look at me. He didn't move. He stood there like a statue of a coward, his shoulders hunched. Look at me and tell me why, I screamed, the scream tearing from my throat and echoing off the low ceiling. I gave you everything. I shared my home, my life, my heart. Why would you destroy the one thing that meant everything to me? Why my grandfather's house? Mark finally looked up, but his eyes were hollow. It was never yours, Elena, he muttered, his voice so weak it was almost pathetic. You just inherited it. You didn't earn it. You lived in that ivory tower while I had to beg for scraps from your table. Do you have any idea what it's like to be the architect's husband? To be a secondary character in your grand design? I supported you, I cried out. I paid for your consulting firm that never made a dime. I paid for your mother's debts. Tamara slammed her hand on the table. Don't you dare talk about debt, you little snob. My son has been a consultant for 18 months. He's been unemployed, living on the allowance you so graciously provided, while he racked up millions in high-interest gambling debt, trying to prove he was your equal. This farm, it's already in foreclosure. We aren't just selling your house for fun, Elena. We're selling it to keep the wolves from the door. Your heritage is our survival. The first twist hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Gambling debt. 18 months of lies. Every business trip was a trip to a casino. Every late night at the office was a desperate gamble with my future. I felt a wave of dizziness, and I had to reach out to the counter to steady myself. But they weren't done. And don't worry about the police, Mark said, his voice gaining a cruel, defensive edge. By the time you get back to the city, if you can even find a way back, there will be a paper trail a mile long showing your instability. Why do you think I've been taking you to those vitamin infusions at that private clinic? Those weren't vitamins, Elena. They were sedative-based cocktails. I have the receipts. I have the medical records I helped you create. To the world, you're a woman who had a nervous breakdown under the pressure of your career and turned to pills. It's all in your file. What file? I whispered, my heart freezing. Tamara stood up and walked toward the hallway. She returned a moment later with a small, clear plastic bag. Inside were several amber prescription bottles with my name on them. I found these in your luggage today, Elena, she said, with a sickeningly sweet smile. I'm so concerned about your addiction. I've already called the local sheriff to report a disturbing episode you had this afternoon. He'll be here soon to do a welfare check. And when he finds these, well, you'll be lucky if they only put you in a psychiatric ward for 72 hours. That's more than enough time for the Silverwood deal to close. My breath hitched. They had planted drugs in my bags. They had been drugging me for months under the guise of wellness. The betrayal was so deep, so multi-layered, it felt like I was drowning in a sea of their filth. I looked at Mark, hoping for some shred of humanity, but he just stared at the floor, his silence more damning than any insult. You're pathetic, I said, the words coming out cold and sharp. Both of you. You think you've won because you have some papers and some pills? You've spent years building a cage for me, but you forgot one thing. Tamara arched an eyebrow. And what's that, princess? I didn't build my career by being soft, I said, taking a step toward her, ignoring the way Mark flinched. I built it by understanding structures. I know where the load-bearing walls are, and I know exactly which part of your little plan is the weakest. Is that so? Tamara sneered, stepping into my personal space. The sheriff is 5 minutes away. You have no money, no car, and your husband is about to testify that you're a danger to yourself. You're nothing. I'm the woman who owns the land you're standing on, I countered, a second twist flashing in my mind, like a bolt of lightning. You forgot, Tamara. When I paid off your roof and your taxes 2 years ago, I didn't just give you the money. I made Mark sign a lien against this farm as a formality, remember? He was so desperate for the cash, he didn't even read the fine print. I don't just own Silverwood. I own a 40% stake in this holy site of labor. And if I'm as unstable as you say, then every legal document Mark has signed in the last year, including that lien and his consulting contracts, is subject to a forensic audit. Mark's head snapped up, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray. The lien! Elena, that was a joke. You said it was for tax purposes. I lied, I said, my voice dripping with the same icy satisfaction they had shown me. Just like you lied. And now, I think it's time we see who the sheriff believes when I show him the hidden recorder I've been wearing in my pocket since I fainted this afternoon. I reached into my mud-stained pocket and pulled out my small professional dictaphone, the one I used for site notes. The little red light was glowing like a demon's eye. The room went deathly silent. The ticking of the clock seemed to stop. The predator and the coward stood frozen as the sound of a distant siren began to wail, drawing closer and closer to the house built on lies. The sight of the small, glowing red light on my dictaphone seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. Tamara's face, previously a mask of triumph, curdled into something primal and ugly. Mark looked like he had been struck by lightning. He actually staggered back, his hand hitting the kitchen table with a clumsy rattle. In that moment, the city princess they had tried to bury in the mud of Oakhaven was gone. Something inside me clicked, a cold structural alignment of purpose. I wasn't just a wife or an architect anymore. I was a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a house of cards. You're bluffing, Tamara hissed, though her voice lacked its previous venom. It was thin, reedy with burgeoning panic. That thing doesn't prove anything. It's my word against yours. It proves intent, Tamara, I said, my voice as level as a foundation beam. It proves the forgery, it proves the drugging, and it proves that Mark knew every single bit of it. I've been recording since the moment you mentioned the closing date. Every word of your confession is on this chip. The siren outside grew deafening, the blue and red lights beginning to pulse against the kitchen wallpaper. Gravel crunched under heavy tires. Mark finally found his voice, but it was the voice of a broken child. Elena, wait. We can talk about this. I was desperate. The debt, the pressure. I didn't want to hurt you. I just needed a way out. I looked at him, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no love, not even pity. He was just a flaw in the design, a piece of rotten timber that had to be removed. You didn't want to hurt me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You drugged me, Mark. You tried to steal my grandfather's legacy and throw me in a psych ward. You didn't need a way out. You needed a victim. The front door opened without a knock. Sheriff Miller, a man whose face was etched with the weary skepticism of 30 years in law enforcement, stepped into the kitchen. He looked at Tamara's tear-streaked face, then at the amber pill bottles on the table, and finally at me, standing there covered in dirt but radiating a terrifying icy calm. I got a call about a disturbance, the sheriff said, his eyes scanning the room. Sheriff, thank God you're here, Tamara wailed, her transition into the role of grieving mother instantaneous and nauseating. She's had another episode. She's been hallucinating, making threats. She even tried to steal my private documents. I didn't interrupt her. I let her spin her web until she ran out of breath. Then, I calmly walked over to the sheriff and handed him the dictaphone. Sheriff Miller, I am Elena Vance. I am the owner of the Silverwood estate in the city. My husband and his mother have held me here against my will, drugged me with unauthorized substances, and forged my signature on documents to liquidate my property. Everything they just said, and everything they've done, is recorded right here. The silence that followed was heavy. The sheriff took the device, his thumb brushing the play button. As the sound of Tamara's voice, spitting out the details of the addiction story and the emerald necklace, filled the cramped kitchen, the color drained from both of their faces. I think, the sheriff said, shutting off the recording and looking at Mark, you'd better put your hands where I can see them, son. The retribution was swift and clinical. The sheriff called for backup, and within an hour, Mark and Tamara were being led to separate patrol cars in handcuffs. Tamara was screaming about betrayal and family blood, but Mark was silent, his head bowed, finally realizing that the woman he thought he could break was the one who had finally broken him. But my work was only beginning. I called my firm's head of legal from the sheriff's office. By midnight, a temporary restraining order had been filed, and a cease and desist was served to the luxury developer. The power of attorney was flagged as a fraudulent document, freezing every account Mark had tried to touch. The vitamin clinic was raided the following morning. The doctor, who had been taking kickbacks from Mark to provide the sedatives, was arrested before his first coffee. It took 6 months to untangle the wreckage. I had to sell the Oakhaven farm, using the lien I had so casually placed years ago, to recoup the savings Mark had gambled away. I watched from my SUV as the auction sign was hammered into the very soil where I had been forced to dig potatoes. I felt no guilt. Tamara was serving a 3-year sentence for fraud and conspiracy, and Mark was facing 5 for a laundry list of felonies, including aggravated assault by way of drugging. Today, the sun is setting over the Silverwood estate, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. The house didn't fall. The Vistas complex was never built. Instead, the manor stands prouder than ever, its windows sparkling like diamonds. I am sitting on the porch, the same place where I once imagined raising a family, with a man I never truly knew. The scent of fresh lilies and expensive coffee fills the air. But there is a new smell, too. The scent of clean rain on stone. My hands are soft again, the blisters and dirt of Oakhaven long gone, replaced by the familiar weight of my drafting pen. I look out at the gates, the wrought iron strong and secure. I've learned that a home isn't just made of wood and marble. It's made of the strength of the person who guards it. I'm no longer the architect of other people's dreams. I'm the architect of my own survival. As I take a sip of my tea, I think of that burlap sack of potatoes on my kitchen counter. It was meant to be the weight that buried me, but instead, it became the foundation of my new life. Because the thing about building something to last is that you have to know exactly what kind of dirt you're standing on. And me? I finally know the value of the ground beneath my feet.